recording. Oh, it is. Thanks, yes, sir, and there's whoever hit that button. And if you do want to hide your camera, go ahead and do that. Another option is always to change your name in Zoom. If you click on participants, you can change your name and change your name to something anonymous, and that's fine. And one thing I remember this time, but sometimes I don't. If there's anything you'd like to discuss and you'd like us to pause the recording, that's also fine too, and we can record it anytime. And if someone would like to send messages in chat anytime for questions, that's fine. A lot of us will be watching that. And if you don't feel comfortable sending it in the public chat for everyone to see, feel free to send it to myself or to anyone who's got a host as the private message, and we'll catch the message. And welcome and thank you. And I'll get out of the way and let the show run.
And I'm so happy that Zoom has changed their terms of service and we are not training the AI.
Here. Will I take a moment now to just share the slides here? Is that okay?
Yep, go ahead, Catherine.
Okie doke.
Wonderful, looks good.
Okay, and what I might just do is take a minute to bring my chat window over here because Laura and I would like to keep this fairly interactive as we're going along. We have a presentation, but it's not going to be all about the presentation. So hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. And thanks to the amazing team at Manifesto. I was sharing with Yasser before we started recording that it's not been possible for me to join live much this summer, but I'm so grateful for the recordings. I know it's not quite the same as being engaged in the chat, but I'm really grateful to the team for making those recordings available for those of us who haven't been able to join. So just so appreciative for all that you are all doing. My name is Catherine Cronin, and I'm here with Lauren, and I'll pass to Lauren in a moment to introduce herself. I've been working in higher education in Ireland for many years. I'm originally from New York, so I have a kind of hybrid accent, which some of you may hear if you're English speakers. I'm working independently now, and for the last 2 years, I've been working with Laura on this project called Higher Education for Good, which we'll talk about today. Laura, would you like to introduce yourself before I get going more?
Sure. I'm Laura Czerniewicz. I'm now a professor emeritus at the University of Cape Town. We have a compulsory retirement age here, which is a mixed blessing, and it does mean that I get to do all the interesting things and none of the bureaucracy. So that's really great. And one of the interesting things has been working with Catherine on this amazing project, which we talk about as if it's a book, but I hope you're going to see is so much more than a book.
Great. Thanks, Laura. Yeah, we are here to discuss Higher Education for Good, which, just as Laura says, is the title of a book that's going to be published, we hope, by the end of September. It will be an open book, so everyone will have access to it. But Higher Education for Good as an idea, as a concept, as an ideal, is something we're all wrestling with. So we want to use that more expansive definition today. So yes, we will talk about the book, but we want to use it as a platform for bigger discussion. I'm going to put a link into the chat of our slides. If there's any problem accessing them, please let us know. And again, we're going to use slides as kind of the skeleton of the session, but we don't want it to be we present all our ideas and then have questions at the end. We'd like to interleave those two strands. So we're in that vein. I want to start with a couple of questions. And when Yasser saw this, he said, "Oh, you're starting with asking, how are you today?" That's what Maha does. And I did definitely learn this with Maha from doing a few sessions with her, and it's become part of my practice also. So we would just love to hear from you if you're willing to write into the chat just how you are this morning, this afternoon, this evening, whatever time of day it is for you. You might let us know. Feeling good, feeling hopeful. Oh, that's lovely, Maha. Happy, slowly recovering. Kathy, glad to hear you're recovering and hope it continues. COVID is still around. Fine, full of energy. Happy to be here. You really are a morning person, Ken, full of energy at your hour. Daniela feeling happy. Happy to learn with everyone today. That's lovely. Thank you all so much. Please, together, Laura and I and the moderators will keep an eye on the chat as much as we can. Feeling good, feeling good. Wonderful. That's lovely, lovely vibe to be joining this morning. And we actually have one other question, if you don't mind, before we start, which is, whoops, just to kind of check in with your own ideas about this whole concept. When you think of good in higher education, what do you think of? It could be anything. It could be something very granular. It could be a big idea. Anything that comes to mind.
And you can speak if you want to. You don't have to only put it in the chat if you'd like to say what you think of. I don't think we have. Well, I don't think we have. Do we have any higher education for good authors here? No. So that's going to be actually really interesting too. Cares.
Value, cares, yes.
Something that isn't the opposite of exploitative.
Mm-hmm. Inclusion. Care, kindness, inclusion, grace, lovely. Good for whom? Yes, Daniela.
Good for the big tech companies, Daniela.
Meaningful. That's a nice one to unpack. Good can have an annoying connotation of righteous, and it can also have a goody two-shoes connotation, Maha says, but it can also be such a simple word for expressing aspiration to do the right thing. A caring, toxic-free environment that is liberatory, emancipatory in its aims, Rissa. Wonderful. Fantastic. Yeah, I mean, Laura, do you want to say anything about those before we go further? That's
it's really interesting to see the word inclusion that comes through here as a thread. Because we could stop there and simply talk about what do we mean by exclusion, but we won't. But we could, because it's just become such an umbrella word, and I think it can mean a whole range of things depending on the level in the system, the question of datification, all sorts of things. So that's a really interesting thread, actually.
And just before we go on, I'll just note Ken saying good for all, inclusion again. And Danielle, thank you. I work in trades education, so goodness would be about improving students' self-worth and their sense of impact on society, how they interact with people and how well they do their work. Amina, good to me is lip service. Can definitely be good washing.
Yep.
And equity. Yes, sir. Thank you. Okay. That's really interesting just to get your sense of this word. I mean, obviously, when we started, it was our question to all the contributors of Higher Education for Good was to unpack good, because it must be unpacked, and we want to get to the meaning. So we'll talk more about that. And I'll just talk to this slide, and then I'll pass over to you, Laura. Unwinding, when we started this project, which was in June of 2021, we started talking about this project of higher education for good as a book, and we opened up the call for chapters 6 months after that. We started here. We started, it was still very much in the teeth of people wrestling with COVID, what that meant personally, and institution-wide, globally. And this notion, as Rosie Berdacci says, that we are in this together, but we are not one and the same. And that led us to some goals that we had around diversity, geographic diversity, higher education in all its instantiations, about what this book could be. So I'm going to pass over to Laura, and she'll talk about trace the beginnings of the book, and then we'll get into its ideas.
So you will remember 2 years ago, sitting in the heart of lockdowns for many of us. And we were looking at this list that we started off with, and look, you know, do we still say the COVID-19 pandemic? So many people behave as if it's over, but it's not over. I mean, aside from the fact that there's a new variant, we are still living with the consequences of that period in education to such a significant extent that even though policymakers would like us to think that it's over, it certainly ain't over. And the climate crisis is more severe than ever. I'm sure that every single person on this call could talk about smoke, floods, very immediate concerns right in their spaces, right in their geographical spheres. Austerity hasn't improved. So it would be great if we'd started and said 2 years ago, these were the real crises and now they're so much better, but actually that's sadly not the case. Austerity is in many cases much worse, certainly for universities in places that relied on international students. So a lot of people lost jobs, in fact, in the last few years. And then deepening inequalities of a whole variety. And it's so striking that when we started this project 2 years ago, generative AI wasn't a thing. It's been so new. And when I think about it now, the question of how generative AI is deepening and amplifying inequality is just so significant. Surveillance, capitalism, and datafication. One thing that I do think is really important is the rise of some kind of pushback. Not least of all is the fact that there were enough people refusing or arguing against the Zoom's terms of service for them to change, arguing back for them to change that. Authoritarianism and war. I mean, we just have to think about the Ukraine, the Sudan, the Sahel. There's just so much going on. And then, of course, the rise of the extreme right. So generally, there's no reason to expect anything other than ongoing instability and so much uncertainty in higher education. And it's really hard not to feel incredible despair at times. It's really heartening at the beginning of this session where everyone was saying they felt good, the real sense of positive energy. Certainly 2 years ago, that wasn't the case. And I would think that in the sector as a whole, there's still a lot of anxiety and despair, actually, strong sense of despair. And that's partly what was the catalyst for this project. And Catherine said that she and I spent 6 months talking before we put out a call in 2022. And that call was, how do we process this despair? How do we acknowledge it? What do you do when you feel this kind of despair? How do you engage in resistance when you feel so overwhelmed? Where do you find the space to imagine alternative futures? And how do you foster hope and courage? How do you feel hope and courage? This image, by the way, is from a fantastic local artist who, in fact, lived very close down the road from where I do. It's a beautiful lino cut. So we were asking one another what is to be done, and we wanted to put out that question to a very broad group of people, which is what led into Higher Education for Good. And it's a book, but as I said earlier, it's also a coalition building exercise through a long process. And if you're interested in the process, we've been blogging about that, and we'll put links to the blogs in the chat. We got to the point now where we had 5 sections in answer to that question, what is to be done? And the first section is on finding fortitude and hope. And sometimes finding that fortitude is about looking at the darkness, as we'll talk about. The next section is about making sense, simply sense making. That's what we do in higher education, of the unknown and the emergent. Then looking particularly at considering alternative futures, and then making change through teaching and assessment and learning design, and then how to rethink structures and systems, so quite high level. And these 5 sections take the chapters that we landed up with, and as I said, we went through quite a long process of filtering these chapters. And I think it works really well as a way of bringing them together, this incredible diversity. So we've got 27 chapters, assorted genres and authors in 18 countries. And just to say something about the genres, it was really important to us as part of a reimagining process to open up the possibility of genres. And we prioritize different genres in a way. So we've got a few chapters in the form of conversations. We've got a visual, a graphic novelette. We've got poetry. We've got one chapter that's written in the form of a haiku with extensive academic references at the bottom. And then lots of conceptual essays. We've also got speculative fiction. And it was really important to us to have artwork. So we actually called for artwork, and we've got artwork, some of which you'll be seeing here today. And then the authors are from lots of places. I mean, I won't read them all out, but pretty varied. By the way, in terms of where authors are from, we ask them where they're from. So we've had some questions along the way of why do you say Scotland, not the UK, or why do you say Hong Kong, not China? That's what people just describe themselves as where they were from. East Africa, there is one chapter that's by a large group of East African scholars. And then, of course, if you included all the peer reviewers, the number goes up dramatically, because we paid a lot of attention to peer review. And we offered open peer review, and I forget the number of countries, but it goes up to something like 30 countries if we include peer reviews. So that's describing the book, and hopefully gave authors freedom to think differently. So what are the topics? We can link to the actual table of contents if you'd like, but the topics include critical data literacies, learning design in different ways, data justice and justice, issues of assessment, infrastructures, both material and infrastructures of care, thinking about collaboration and partnership, entire systems, as we mentioned earlier, open and other systems, decoloniality, open knowledge, and new types of business models. So it's pretty wide ranging, and it also ranges from deeply theoretical to experience-based.
Laura's
Whoops.
We
Laura,
lost the sound of Laura.
can you hear
Yeah.
us, Laura? Okay, we were just about to hand over again, so I'll take that as my prompt, and hopefully
Thanks,
Laura can jump back in again. Let's see here now. What we'd like to do for the rest of the presentation is just share that Laura shared a lot of the front end work, and then we worked with authors, from diverse contexts and cultures and roles and institutions. And then our task at the end was to look across all of the chapters and try and identify common strands, values, principles, and so on, if we could. And the word manifesto kept coming up, but we weren't comfortable calling it a manifesto. So what we landed on was towards a manifesto, as just a nod, really an acknowledgement of all of those unique contexts and authors and cultures, as I said. So it's not a declarative manifesto in the sense that there's not a sense of sequence or flow or any idea of completion, or that is a single manifesto. It's a collective and diverse chorus of authors that have identified these principles and in really different ways, and identified a lot of interesting ideas under each one. So what we thought we would do in the session today is just present these in turn, and after each one, we'll just want to pause and check in with you and get your ideas and so on. So we'll just share each of these in turn and then open up for discussion with you, if that's okay. So the 5 tenets, as we call them, of the manifesto that all of the authors collectively have done is to acknowledge the importance of naming and analyzing the troubles of higher education, to challenge assumptions and resist hegemonies, and then make the turn from, identifying the troubles and despair and so on to making claims, positive claims for just, humane, and globally sustainable higher education, courageously imagine and share fresh possibilities, and then make positive changes here and now. Laura, are you back?
I am back, sorry, technical hitch.
Okay, that's great. So this will be a two-hander here. I'll name each of the tenets. Laura might jump in, and then we would like to open it up to the group. So the first tenet, as I said, is to name and analyze the trouble of higher education. And, we quote James Baldwin in our introduction here, who says that, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And the quote by Miranda Fricker there was also really inspiring to us. Those of you who are familiar with Fricker's work on epistemic justice, she describes so powerfully how it is important to study injustice before we can describe and theorize justice. And she says the negative imprint reveals the form of the positive value. So that was our stance, really, in terms of inviting people to name and analyze. So what kinds of troubles and problems are named and analyzed? Here we have, neoliberalism and the damage wrought to HE by neoliberalism, not just economically, but culturally as well, in terms of mindsets, practices, and so on. Coloniality and the logic that endures, the colonial logic that endures in systems, practices, structures of power. Data extraction, which Laura has already mentioned, and we would like to hear more from you, again, alluding to the business models of big tech, which became particularly entrenched during the pandemic. And really, broadly speaking, multiple forms of inequality and exclusion. So unequal global access, surveillance technologies, and all the ways that particularly digital education mirrors material realities and inequalities. So Laura, I'll hand over to you if you want to add anything more, and then really we'd like to invite discussion on this, comments, questions, anything.
I just want to mention that we also quoted Ursula Le Guin. Some of you might remember her from wonderful early science fiction, which we're finding so useful nowadays. And she spoke about the power of a name. So it was something we found, that we asked people to talk about good, but they seemed to need to name evil. They seemed to need to talk about darkness. And we came to realize that that's actually part of the processing. And one of the chapters is actually about cursing the darkness and the value of doing that in order to enable good. So I just wanted to add that.
Thanks, Laura.
Earthsea indeed.
Sorry, I'm just trying to look at the chat again. We'd really, if anyone wants to get on the mic or put their thoughts in the chat, does this resonate with anyone? Do you want to add anything? Do you want to question something, probe at any of this? Obviously, this is kind of a high level description, but this is what so many of our authors engaged in, even though, as Laura says, we asked them to talk about the good. It had to start here.
I'll jump in just for a second, Catherine. So it's interesting that in the chat brought up the point of that good is lip service, or it's really depending on the context. And I find that interesting with my computing students in an age of the big buzzword is AI, but where we talk about things like, is Amazon a good company? And say a lot of them think so, or is what Elon Musk do good? And a lot of them think him as some tech bro hero. And we get into discussions of, Well, in many ways, it's not good. And in my opinion, it's not. And going into the discussions and bringing up that dichotomy a little bit as well. And perhaps there's a generational gap there as well between myself and my students. But yeah, this thinking of what is good is really, really important. I love this.
Thanks, Ken. Thank you.
One of the things that I've been doing lately is reading a lot about the impact of the tech sector on carbon emissions and water. And in fact, Amazon in Africa has incredibly high emissions for data centers. It's I think the third highest in the world. So if you start adding that as a good, if that becomes one of your measures, it complicates good as well. And it's an interesting thing that in the book, there is a theme of climate change, and you'll see that we use the theme of trees. In fact, this particular image that's showing now is one of the images in the book. We like it because it's quite a knotted, gnarled tree, which kind of speaks to this particular tenet.
Yeah, and your comment, Ken, and also Mags, I see, wrote, is the subtle nuanced difference between good and for good is interesting. Is there's a range in how authors name and analyze the troubles of HE, and some are naming things that are big and identifiable and have names, and others are really trying to point out that a lot of the troubles of HE are the water that everyone is swimming in, and that it sometimes takes a lot of courage and work to name it and hold it up so that people can see it and name it, like what Laura just talked about, like the carbon and ecological footprint of companies like Amazon, which at face value many people would say, oh yeah, they're a good company, they're fine. So there's a lot of work in digging into the roots and shaking the soil off and showing them to people. And that's what a lot of the authors have done in the book, which is really interesting. We in these critical circles may easily name all these things, but in general practice, that is not always the case, as we know.
Hand up there with Maha.
Maha, thanks.
Yeah, so I've noticed you said that some authors do this and some authors do that, and I'm kind of curious if any of the authors had a balance of doing sort of both the micro and the macro thinking. Because when I was, I'm looking at the kinds of themes you have and thinking about higher education for good. Initially, when I read the call, or maybe I didn't read it closely, but I remember like hearing for good always seemed to me about the impact of higher education on the world outside of higher education. But then when you're talking today, there seems to be also a lot of inward thinking. I think they're both needed, obviously. And you sort of are saying, some people are saying on the theoretical level, some on the more practical level. And I'm just wondering if someone merge of, how sort of the importance of working on both together. Did some of the chapters do a better job of that?
I'm thinking of one, Laura, unless you want to jump in there first.
No, I'm actually looking to share the table of contents with you. So while I look for that, maybe you can answer, Catherine.
I actually posted our updates page in the chat. I'll put it in again.
Oh, okay.
I'll just put it back here. So we just have a Google Doc, which is called our HE for Good updates document, and the table of contents is there and links to blogs.
Great. Okay.
Blogs and so on. So that's there. But I'm thinking of and by the way, we all of our authors knew that we were doing this today. We're trying to do things with authors as much as possible, and in some cases when we've presented, authors have been in the room, but not today, unfortunately. But Kate Malloy and Claire Thompson, for example, wrote a more practical, focused chapter about learning design, but they reached over to Adrienne Marie Brown's emergent strategy and other concepts, and kind of, carried that over into what they're actually doing in terms of learning design, particularly in pandemic times. So there are others, but that's one, because we asked people all the time if they were talking about things that were specific and local, how that related to larger structural issues. We asked them to map that, and So Laura, I don't know, you might mention any of the other chapters if you want.
Yeah, I think our chapter on universal design for learning and justice also theorized what they were talking about. So they had an example, but it was they were looking at it more broadly beyond that. It's a great example. So sometimes people start with, there's one case where it starts with a vignette and then it looks at the broader implications. Whereas as you can see now that you've got the access to the chapter, some of them simply work at the bigger level, either theoretically or systemically.
Yes, I just put a little note in the chat about that chapter as well. It was really, really interesting chapter. 4 graduate students at UCT who were working as technology advisors during the pandemic found deficiencies in, as they said, in a global South context in the definition of access that's used in UDL. So they brought another lens, which is social justice and design justice, and combined those and made a case for everyone doing that. Very powerful chapter. Okay, might we go on to the next tenet maybe and just keep the chain going, because I don't want to run out of time before we get to the hope at the end.
Yes.
That wouldn't do. Okay, the second tenet was about, as we mentioned, challenging assumptions and resisting hegemonies. And I know Laura and I both really love this quote by Arundhati Roy, that there's really no such thing as the voiceless. There are only the deliberately silenced or the preferably unheard. I also want to say that as we were preparing for this session today, so many of these things are the tenets and the values that are woven into Manifesto and Equity Unbound. So I know this is not going to be unfamiliar to people here. So the challenging assumptions was about things like recentering, making sure that, you know, we are actively bringing in from the margins voices and views that should be heard, crossing borders, all kinds of borders, geographic, disciplinary, status, accepted genre, as Laura's already mentioned, and challenging dominant narratives, things like pushing back, as you mentioned, Ken, against dominant Silicon Valley or big tech narratives of education. And, you know, so there are a number of chapters which are, you know, data justice informed approaches to higher education for good. So I'm just going to check the chat here and pass over to you, Laura, and just maybe get some thoughts from the group. Amina. I mean, that's such a good question. I would love to keep in touch as well. And I was active on Twitter for many years, and I'm not at the moment. But I am on Mastodon, and I am on LinkedIn. And if you look at my Twitter page, you'll see links to my other spaces. Yeah, Mastodon is where we're mostly active, but would love to chat with you. I'm sorry, Laura, did you want to add something else?
No. Same point.
Rissa, I'm not sure that good is a word I would use to describe higher education. I want to be good within it, but is the system too broken to be good? Question. Serious question. Yes.
And I'm curious to know about your concern about the word recentering.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I feel like I mean, maybe I'm just being warning in advance. When it's 6 o'clock in the morning, I get super philosophical. So who knows? This might be too ethical for too much of an ethical moment. But like the idea of recentering brings back whatever is dominant. And so are we trying to, it gets into a whole bunch of problems for me, because I'm like, are we trying to get back to a dominant? Maybe it's not the dominant that exists, but are we trying to redo it? I mean, could the dominant just be as bad as anything else we've come up with, or worse? And so when we recenter a dominant, if recentering means pulling towards the dominant, I don't know that I want to recenter. I want to break it into quantum level clusters. Like everyone has a voice and everyone is able to use that voice in something more towards a participant democracy. I don't want to center anything. That was my moment. So just in case you were wondering, I'm going to stop now.
Laura and I have talked about it. You jump in, Laura, because
we've talked about this so much, because the intention is definitely not to create a new center that then new peripheries. So if that's the connotation, then that's not what's obviously intended, and that's really helpful to hear that. It's really about it's really more about challenging hegemonies, and the fact that hegemonies take such primacy in discourses, and anything outside of those hegemonies are just not taken seriously. So that's really what that's about. And I am a little bit mindful of time, but I really appreciate that observation. Thank you.
Amina's got her hand up.
Thank you. I just wanted to quickly chime in and comment on that about the recentering. And this is something that Bell Hooks, and who is a Black radical feminist or womanist, educator and author, and also Bettina Apicather. I always mispronounce her name, but she's a really incredible, she's a feminist writer, educator, scholar as well. And they both talk about, so Bell Hooks talked about it back in 1985. Some other feminist scholars talked about it as well. And Bettina talked about it in about 1980, about pivoting the center. So it's not about recentering and about like who's dominant and who's not dominant. It's about changing just simply who we're focusing on right now based on the needs that need to be met. And it really resonates for me all the time. And it's something I hope like resonates as well with some of y'all. Yeah, just the idea of pivoting the center rather than making this person the most important person in the room. It's just about changing who like it's about equity and agency, right? I don't know. I'm really keen to hear what others think, and who especially those who've read those works as well.
Thank you so much, Amina. That's really useful, and Rissa as well, and pivoting. Laura and I mean, we often use physical metaphors for the kinds of things we're talking about. So crossing borders, smudging borders so that they're not as rigid. Recentering is a term that we've used in terms of if the center is considered de facto center, pulling the lens over and recentering, you know, the mic, the space, the light onto, you know, voices and views that are not often, you know, centered and foregrounded and so on. So, you know, there's a paucity and a poverty in some of these terms, but it's, you know, it's about shaking up and challenging and power, basically. Bettina, thank you, Amina. We should probably go on, and we'll have more chance to chat at the end, but this is so illuminating. So thank you. I'll go on to tenet 3, if that's okay, which is about making claims. So once we name the problems and say, listen, these are other ways of looking at things. These are other lenses, other spaces, other voices that we can look at. What are our claims? What do we want to say? And collectively, the authors in this book make claims that are for higher education that is just, humane, and sustainable. That's both locally and globally. And, you know, we borrowed from Amanda Gorman. It's about, you know, lifting our gaze, you know, once we've acknowledged the despair and named the problems. And that includes things like being explicit about our values. And in this book, the values are, equity and justice, all different interpretations and kinds of justice: social justice, economic justice, epistemic justice, data and design justice, mutuality, collectivism, and so on. There's so much more. There are a number of chapters that really use theory and also use the form of theory-informed practice to dissect and really unpack what does good mean, what is common good in relation to public good, in relation to social good. Those discussions are in the book, which we really found useful. And then different structures and forms of governance for higher education that may be possible, like knowledge commons and indigenous knowledges and epistemologies within higher education. So Laura, I don't know if you want to say anything else, and then again, we'd love to hear.
I thought I was going to make the point you've made, that one of the things I found really helpful and interesting in the book is the way people homed in on types of good. So public good, social good, different people explored different ways of considering what do we mean by the public good in an age of public-private partnerships, or what is a social good look like? And I think many people are tired of that word good because it can have too many meanings. So people went back to some theory, and I hope that that's going to be one of the most valuable things in the book, actually, is those explorations.
Would love thoughts, ideas, questions, different metaphors. Who decides? Yes, indeed. Who decides what is the public good? And, MAGs again, I mean, that's sometimes where links back to the recentering. So if we expose the fact that we primarily center on, global North voices and publishers and predominantly white and so on, and that whether we call it recentering or redrawing the boundaries or the borders or whatever, that helps us to answer the question of who defines good, who defines public. We want to diversify that who. That's essential. Sorry, just keeping an eye on the chat here. Laura, am I missing something?
No, I don't think so yet. I'm trying to keep an eye on it all in case something needs to be voiced. Rissa said, is this evidentiary or policy-based or both?
Yep,
What about
and
Laura's
theoretical.
answering? Go ahead.
Yep, and theoretical. It must be more complex, but the surface is hiding the depth. I know it's really hard to do an overview of this. We've done this a few times before, and it's frustrating because certain aspects resonate for different people in different ways. And it's frustrating to be able to say, yes, there's a chapter on that, especially when the book's not out yet. But I hope that it's still valuable to do that, because as you can imagine, Catherine and I spent so long trying to come up with 5 key tenets. And in a way, what we're wanting to do today is share what we came up with as the key tenets. We started off with whatever it was. What was it, Catherine? 12? It was 8. These, if you're interested in some kind of a better higher education system, and we're all assuming that is the one we have is broken, problematic, fractured, how do we think about that? What are the strategies that we have? What are the mechanisms that we have for thinking about that? If we wanted to create a manifesto, what would be the key elements? And in a way, I think that's what we are able to share with you and ask you about.
Can I ask a question? I think I know which word is the one that's bothering me here, because every other word in this slide is good, but the word that's repeated 3 times that is bothering me is the word claim. So it's
really?
make claims. Yeah, why make I think you mean something different, because claim can have 2 meanings, right?
What's the second one?
Claim as in you have ownership for, and you can make a claim as in you just make a lip service statement. And you don't mean make a lip service statement.
I didn't even think of that.
Yeah, that's what was bothering me. So as a non-native speaker, but I think
no,
even native
wow.
speakers would see both of these. And I realized just now, as I was about to make the objection, that no, you mean claim and grow theories for good. Let's take the theories for good and grow them
Oh,
rather than
wow.
make claims.
Oh,
You see?
wow. Oh,
That's why I've been struggling with it.
Oh, wow.
Interesting. It didn't come up in discussions with the authors, but again, that's just one group of people.
That's
But-
fascinating.
Mhm.
So you claim something,
Very
but it's
interesting.
actually not true.
Mhm.
Yeah, or I mean, yeah, claim
Yeah,
as in
yeah.
a statement rather than
Yeah,
make
yeah.
a claim as in lay, like as in have ownership over a thing, right?
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
say, I am going to be responsible and own this thing, which is, I think, what you meant.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
Wow. What would you say then? What
Mhm.
what if you wanted to, because what we wanted to do, it's really, in fact, we had stake a claim at one point, you know, like put your
That would be more explicit. If you
Mm.
said stake a claim, then
Mm.
that expresses it in that sense. I
Mhm.
think when you
Okay.
say make claim or make explicit claim,
Mhm.
it
Okay.
sounded, yeah. I mean, you guys have been thinking about this for months, so I'm not going to be able to
Yeah,
in a
yeah. No,
second
that's
come up
great.
with something better. I'm just letting you know how it
No,
sounded to me.
no, that's brilliant.
on
It's
the-
useful.
And also because we eventually decided against take a claim, so we'll have to try and remember why we decided against it. I can't even remember.
I guess it sounds a bit colonialist as a like stake
Exactly.
a
Yeah, I
Exactly.
think
claim
that was
land.
why. That was probably
But,
Exactly.
yeah, I'm sure at some point it'll clear
But
out.
thank you
clear
for
out.
that, because that had
Mhm.
not, and it hasn't come up with anyone else we've spoken to. So that's
Mhm.
just so helpful.
It's useful, particularly pre-publication, because it helps us to be really clear when we communicate about it. So I might just really quickly go through the next two and then just open up for discussion maybe together, just so
Yep.
so the fourth of the five, so make claims is really the twist, you know, again, from looking at the despair and analyzing the negative to so what do we want instead? You know, what positive claims for higher education. So the next two are to imagine and share fresh possibilities. As Octavia Butler says, we will dream our way out. We must imagine beyond the given. And Ruha Benjamin, again, shifting our imagination. So not just staying rooted in the earth that we are in, but imagining better futures. So we have a number of chapters. There's a chapter that uses African futurist speculative fiction as a plan for working with students to get them to imagine fresh possibilities, speculative methods, speculative imaginaries with students. There are two chapters in the form of poetry, one in the form of an amazing haiku with footnotes, scholarly footnotes. There's a chapter in the form of an image and audio track, and as Laura said, a graphic reflection. So we really let authors be as imaginative as they want to inform as well as content. And then the final tenet is making positive changes here. Now, this is an older quote, but we felt it really resonated in that change is possible and the time is now. So the tenets here are about the importance of repairing the past, the importance of redress in various forms, being comfortable with the fact that in some of our roles, our change will be small scale, but that small changes matter and streams become rivers. Change is possible, and the importance of communality and coalition, which is essential. So, and this wonderful paper that was published last year by Farhana Sultana about climate coloniality. She says, it is in the many acts, small and large, acting in constellations and collectivities over time and place that bear results. So those are the tenets, you know, for what it's worth. And the whole act of creating the book has been, we think, like a communal and border crossing act, and you know, the group of authors acts as a coalition. So we'd love your thoughts and comments and fresh
So
perspectives.
just to add, in the introduction to the book, we don't do a here's the book, this is what each of the chapters are about. It's structured through these tenets, and we provide examples from all the different chapters of how these are done. And so when it came to finalizing what we thought the tenets were, we were informed both by the literature of hope that we read very widely beyond education, but very largely from the chapters. What did this community of authors from so many different countries, what did they share? What did they teach? What did they bring together? And that's where it came from.
Yeah, Maha, we blogged about this recently, about how important that was, about trying to model the values that we thought the book could hold with the process of creating this community of authors and working together and inviting authors to to cross-pollinate their chapters. So it's been a great experience for us, very humbling, in fact.
I mean, we had, I think, four sessions that we hosted for authors to get together and write and talk and so on, which was great. Yeah, it's the community of authors. It's in our blogs. I think we did include the link to the blog.
Mm-hmm. I think, yeah, so you're asking if that is in a section in the book. We allude to it in our introduction, but it's not a section of the book. Thank you for that question, though. The book is very big. And we decided to go with a as tight an introduction as we could, and then we thought we'd blog and maybe write a chapter for a journal afterwards, kind of reflecting on that process of the book more thoroughly.
But you're right, yes, a couple of the authors actually said we need to write about this.
Yes. I'm glad you found hope in that last one, Mags. That's, yeah. I mean, we didn't want it to be glib hope. It is rooted in the actual and in theory and so on. But the whole goal is that the whole goal is hope, because we were inspired by work in climate justice, like Mary Robinson's work, and social justice that doesn't just diagnose what's wrong, but really looks to paths towards hopeful futures. We were really inspired by those kinds of works, and we wanted the book to be, in that party, in that kind of literature. And then our last, so we end the introduction, and we send the book to its life once it finds readers as really a reflection on hope, and hope in all its different guises, as balm, as antidote, as continual. One of my favorite quotes, again, hope is invented every day, from James Baldwin. And our last slide is from one of the authors of the book. This is Sherry Spellick, who contributed a chapter that consists of a small collection of poems.
Shall I read it?
Please, Laura, yeah.
If my students and I build anything, we must build imaginations. If my students and I build a city of care, a province of justice, a nation of acceptance, we're never done and always beginning. And maybe we can end by the last slide, I think, has a link to the, oh, well, I don't know if we can have time to talk about this. But we also loved, I just wanted to say, we love the image of the that we used on the front cover, which is this boat, which you will see is in a stormy sea, and it's growing a tree. And we are so grateful to George, whose surname I can never pronounce properly. Can you, Catherine?
Spugaras.
Thank you.
I put the alt text in earlier. I'll just try and find it again.
Because he's given us access to this image for the book, which of course was done on no budget, just to be clear. And I must say, we are very impressed with open book publishers who are publishing this, who did not charge anything either. So this is not one of those author pays book publishing charges. They cross-subsidize their books, and they choose on the basis of quality and whether it fits their list. So it's been a great pleasure working with them, and they've been very transparent about the costs and so on. This is not a sales pitch. It's just been a wonderful experience. The only thing I'm slightly concerned about is the date of publication, because it's been the long summer holidays in the north. So I'd be surprised if it actually comes out in September. I think it's more likely to be October or November, but that's understandable.
We are hopeful.
No, we are hopeful. And maybe
So
in
did
the
you
last-
want people? Did you want people to answer that question about where they find
We
hope?
do. I was about to say,
Please.
if you do have time, I'd really like to hear where you find hope. We would.
Mhm.
Oh, yes, it has his hand up.
Ah,
Yeah, I was just gonna answer this question. I find hope in openness. Like there is always an idea of openness in either in the community, in the classroom, out of the classroom. So you get to experience whatever you want to experience in an idea of an open manner without any enforced teaching dichotomies or whatever. And I find hope is in the idea of social justice call. So we're calling for social justice in education. So bringing more, lending more support to equity. So all of this gives me hope, you know. I was glad to see the chapter on UDL and all that. So yeah, that's the hope I kind of hope to embark on now.
thank you, Yasser. And it's really lovely hearing that from you. You shared your positionality when you started about being, a student just last year and, being very involved in MyFest. And what we didn't mention, but I'll mention now, is that we have 2 forewords and 2 afterwords in the book. And this last afterword, which is called The Last Word, we invited a student, a doctoral student, a young woman from India, because, Laura and I felt we're talking about the future. We're talking about a future that goes well beyond us. And so we sought to have many voices in the book that are younger scholars and students, but particularly the last word in the book is from a student. So thank you.
I guess I'm gonna stop the recording. So if anyone has a final word to say, that would be the end. So thank you so much for this great session.
Thank you, Yasser.